Now that we have a conceptual and institutional basis for colonial America, let's tell some stories. I know it may be hard to listen to these stories while staring at what is in essence an inert screen, but bear with me. The stories are designed to illustrate how the concepts and institutions we have discussed impacted real people, and how those people impacted the development of Constitution and law. We must remember that the Americans who would fight a revolutionary war and adopt a new constitutional order in the 1770s and 80s were shaped by this world, and the document that they wrote reflected, at least in part, the experiences of the colonists in the 17th and 18th centuries. The first story is that of John Winthrop. He was the first governor of Massachusetts, and he played a pivotal role in establishing the institutions of that colony, as well as influencing the development of other New England colonies. Winthrop was a leading Puritan in England, although his prospects were somewhat limited. He came from a propertied family. He was educated at Trinity College, Cambridge. College education was a rarity in those days. John was then educated in the law and became a petty officer, both a justice of the peace and eventually as the common attorney for the Court of Wards. The Court of Wards, and I should say this latter post as the common attorney for the Court of Wards was an enormously lucrative one, but it exposed John Winthrop very early to corruption. The Court of Wards existed to take care of children whose parents held their lands directly from the king, and who, for whatever reason, were not there to take care of their children. There are a variety of reasons, not the least of which being, a forfeiture of property for various reasons. In theory, the Court of Wards was supposed to oversee the administration of the children's inheritances. In reality, wardships were sold to the highest bidder. Then whoever bought them would fleece the underage heirs until they came of age. So Winthrop was brought face to face with this corruption, and it troubled him. In the 1620s, many would look back at Elizabethan England of the late 16th century as a golden age, and they believed that they lived in evil and declining times. When Winthrop agreed to go to the New World, he was embarking on what he termed an errand into the wilderness. By this, he meant a spiritual journey with a specific purpose, to live right according to God and to provide a model for Europe back home. This was why Winthrop called the newly established port of Boston a city upon a hill. It was to be a shining example of what an ideal community would look like. The Puritans who set sail were all of this common purpose. One of their great innovations was to pick up the charter that King Charles had granted them and take it with them. This had two effects. The first was to physically separate themselves from the realm in a way that the Virginia Company had never done. Stockholders in England had made decisions for the Virginia Company, at least until reforms instituted a measure of local control. In Massachusetts, it would be all run from the New World. The second effect was that when Charles would demand the charter for inspection in the late 1630s, no one could produce it. He was forced to send commissioners to retrieve it, and this delay would save the colony, because by the time the commissioners went back, war had broken out in England. I'm going to skip a lot of history here for obvious reasons, but you should be aware that the Puritans would never have survived had not the Indians aided them. Likewise, the Puritans declared their first war on the Pequot Indians in 1637, largely because expansion had created struggles over territory. So I'm not going to talk about this very important history, because the story I want to tell is about authority within the colony. The General Quarterly Court of Massachusetts was established by the charter. The members of the company, and they were all termed freemen, were to meet 4 times a year in a general court. An executive council was supposed to meet once a month. 18 assistants were to be elected from the general court, at least 6 of which would meet with the governor once a month to administer government. The charter itself nominated the first governor, Winthrop, and his assistants. By the charter, they had absolute authority, but they did not turn this authority into an authoritarian rule. They might have, and it is important to note that they chose otherwise. After the Puritans arrived in 1629, the governor and assistants met as the General Quarterly Court for the first time on August 23, 1630. During this meeting, the governor and assistants made ordinances, they exercised the authority of the General Quarterly Court, and then they adjourned. Then, on October 19, 1630, Winthrop summoned a general court meeting. He and his assistants then established a government. The freemen, and Winthrop here expands the definition of freemen to mean all of the householders of Massachusetts, all those who were migrants into Massachusetts and were members in good standing of the church. All of these freemen were given the right to elect the assistants. The assistants would then in turn elect the governor, the deputy governor, and the other officers. The first elections were held and the assistants were named. And Winthrop was the first elected governor. So now we have one of our first working representative democracies in North America. And democratic trouble followed. Winthrop, quite early on, this is by about 1632, would be accused by Thomas Dudley of misgovernance. Now, Dudley was a cold man. He was a Puritan who believed very much that John Winthrop was too lenient, that he allowed those with semi-orthodox beliefs to get by, and he wanted to establish a much stricter, more disciplined colony. So Dudley, upset with the way Winthrop was governing, demanded to know where Winthrop got his authority. And Winthrop replied, by the charter. Dudley, and this is in open court, replied that the charter granted the governor no other authority than any other assistant. In other words, the governor had no authority above and beyond that of any other assistant. Winthrop answered to this that he had all the powers of a governor as allowed by the common law. Now, this is a big trump because Winthrop, being a trained lawyer, understood the common law pretty well, and Dudley, despite being very intelligent, simply did not. So Dudley examined the charter and then claimed that all the freemen, that is, all the people that he believed had come to Massachusetts, should have a right to vote in all the new laws. Now, at this point, Winthrop had to explain to Dudley that when he had interpreted freemen back in 1630 to mean all the members of the colony, he was not interpreting this in the same way that it was meant in the charter. The charter referred only to the members of the company. And so this is what Winthrop answers. And unfortunately, actually, he loses this point, at least unfortunately for Winthrop. At the next election that is held, this is occurring 1632-33, and they have elections in 1634. At the next election of 1634, Winthrop would be returned as an assistant, but he would not be elected governor, and he would not hold the governorship for several years. And that year, on September 18th of 1634, 200 new Puritans arrived in Boston on several ships. This was in large part of the Great Migration of the 1630s, right at the point when the Anglican Church underneath Charles I is becoming less and less Puritan, and Puritans are being silenced. We start to see Puritans flowing out of England, and they are heading increasingly for Boston. And you start to see them first settling in all the towns around Boston, but then ultimately they begin moving for the other river valleys, and we start to see, over the course of the 1630s, approximately 10,000 people will flow into New England. As I've already discussed, they're not all Puritans. We need to make that very clear. But this great migration would be a huge context to the events which follow. So on September 18th of 1634, 200 new Puritans arrived in Boston, and among them were William and Anne Hutchinson. And they themselves had followed the Puritan minister John Cotton, who had arrived sometime earlier. Cotton was a fiery Puritan minister in England who had been silenced by Charles I's bishops. He set sail to the Puritan colony in order to preach the Puritan gospel that he believed. When he arrived in New England, and this is important, he's arriving in New England, the colony is scarcely a few years old, he already rails there about the signs of declension that he sees around him. Anne Hutchinson and her husband became followers of John Cotton back in England. They followed him to New England, and in Boston they became his allies. It took a while for them to be admitted to the church, but by 1636 they were admitted as members of the church. And by the way, I know I'm not explaining this. If somebody can ask it in class, if we need to discuss what it meant to be admitted to a church, which carries with it the voting privileges in the General Quarterly Court, we can talk about it then. Now, Anne Hutchinson began holding meetings in her home following Sunday services. So Cotton would give his services, and then Anne Hutchinson would hold meetings in her home, and people would come and discuss his sermons. She was a very talented theologian in her own right, and she began taking Puritan dogma to its logical extreme. And this becomes known as the antinomian heresy. Uh, Antinomianism was, at least in Anne Hutchinson's formulation, works something like this. She said that God, when God chose to save somebody, immediately placed the Holy Ghost upon them. At the point that the Holy Ghost was placed inside this person, the man essentially ceased to become a man and became directed by the Holy Ghost. And this goes one step further. Those with the Holy Ghost in them, she said, could recognize it in oneself and recognize it in others. Now, this breaks with Puritan orthodoxy. While the Puritans themselves believed in no bishop and were against the kind of hierarchical authority of the Catholic and Anglican churches, they do believe in orthodoxy and they disdain heresy. There's only one truth, with a capital T, in Puritanism. And Anne Hutchinson's philosophies, as well as those whom she was supporting, John Cotton and another man by the name of John Wheelwright, they were essentially breaking Puritan orthodoxy. And the problem then becomes, how do you enforce orthodoxy within a democratic community? It can only really be established by consent. And quite quickly it became apparent that we are lacking a kind of unified consent in Massachusetts. One faction is following John Cotton and Hutchinson in this new form of extreme Puritanism and antinomianism. Another followed Winthrop and the older guard Puritans. In May of 1637, an election was held. And Cotton's representative, John Cotton's representative, a man by the name of Henry Vane, lost the election. Winthrop was reelected governor. Now, Winthrop immediately tried to make peace, but the factions proved too far splintered to do so. And so he takes the next step, which is on August 30th, he had all of the Puritan ministers convened in a synod. This included, by the way, ministers from neighboring Connecticut. And for 24 days, these Puritan ministers debated theology. And then they unanimously, or I shouldn't say unanimously, but nearly unanimously, they agreed on a Puritan orthodoxy, and then demanded that everybody teach this Puritan orthodoxy. It declared that the principles formerly taught by John Cotton, who was a member of the synod, by the way, declared that those doctrines were in fact heresy. John Wheelwright, one of the extreme ministers, was then in November called before the general court and tried for heresy. He was found guilty and he was banished. Next, it was Anne Hutchinson's turn. She also was tried for heresy. And as you will know from reading the documents, the end result of that would be that she was banished. I hope you can get a sense from this story about how messy the making of government really was in New England. There is a reason why the documents that demonstrate this establishment of government in New England are really just all a work in progress. It also indicates why experiments with democracy proved to be a mixed blessing. Puritans revered order and freedom, and the two did not go hand in hand in a way they imagined they would. We can, I suppose, say that the Puritans naively believed that if everybody was allowed to freely worship, that they would freely come to the same conclusion about what the truth was. The end result is something far less than that. It's a lot more dissension. It's also a huge debate about how you ensure order and how you square this with liberty. The second story takes us to Colonial Virginia, and it is the story of Anne Orthwood. For the record, Anne Orthwood was not a historic figure in the mold of someone like John Winthrop or Anne Hutchinson. She was an indentured servant. But her story is important because she interacted with very powerful people, and it illustrates a very common experience in the New World. Anne Orthwood arrived in Virginia as an indentured servant in November of 1662. She was among a number of servants who signed an indenture pledging service for a term of 7 years in return for her passage to the New World and for care once she arrived. Indentured servants were a primary source of labor for New World planters in Virginia and Maryland. They were also present in every other colony, although fairly uncommon in New England, where most migrants were members of intact families. It is worth pointing out here that indentured servants were not free. They could not walk out on their indentures. They were subject to the authority of their masters. They were not slaves, but they were treated much more harshly than indentured servants in England. For instance, by the common law, no indentured servant could have their indenture transferred without their consent. But in the New World, this was done frequently. In essence, there was a market for indentures, and they were traded around in the same manner that slaves were. Given that most indentured servants in the early 17th century died during service, many never experienced freedom at all, and many were forced into indentures against their will. Kidnapping was a particularly heinous way to supply labor in the New World, but it occurred. Slavery, a form of legal kidnapping, would soon overtake both indentured servitude and illegal kidnapping as the primary means of supplying labor to the New World. And this is just to give you some sense of historical background to this. There are migration waves into the New World and into the Chesapeake. And up until 1640, there's a wave of migration into these areas. But after 1640, and in particular between 1640 and 1660, legal migration, free migration, essentially declines. And at that point, we start to see a rise of unfree migration. We see rises in kidnapping, and we see a rise in a turn to slavery as a means of supplying labor. Labor was very scarce in the New World. And so labor is, understanding that is central to understanding the experience of the New World. And the question, of course, immediately comes up. Why would a young woman, Anne Orthwood in this case, willingly indenture herself? And I guess I should make clear here as well, the protections for indentured servants essentially extended to life and limb. Otherwise, they were corrected frequently by their masters. They were beaten, legally so. They were subject to the will of their masters. They could not travel without a pass. They really had no freedoms whatsoever. So they really were a kind of quasi-free, slave-like sort of character. So why would she willingly indenture herself? Simply put, she had no prospects at home. She was poor in England. Her family could not care for her. There was no work there. In Virginia, she had opportunities. She had marriage prospects. Or at least this is what promoters claim. The first thing that happened to her when she arrived was that her master immediately traded her to another master. Her new master was William Kendall. William Kendall was in fact an interesting figure. He arrived in Virginia as an indentured servant himself. He survived his indenture, and he was legally freed from the indenture in 1654. His former master clearly favored him and patronized him. He was his patron. And as a result, he was able to earn a fortune in the commercial trade. A scant 3 years after his freeing from his indenture, this is 1657, William Kendall bought 600 acres of land and a house, the Newport House, which was the seat of his tobacco plantations. This was a parvenu. Parvenu means a man who had begun with nothing and had risen to wealth. And as is fitting for a parvenu, somebody of new money, he made ostentatious displays of his worth. He took the title of lieutenant colonel in the militia. He used it whenever he could. He accepted the office of churchwarden, which involved punishing fornicators and drunks in Northampton County, where he lived. He also began recruiting servants, and this is why he acquired Anne Orthwood's indenture in 1662. But William's household also included his nephew, John Kendall. And after a few months of having Anne Orthwood in the house, it became clear to the colonel that John and Anne had feelings for each other. So he sold Anne's indenture again. And although the records are unclear about this, he very likely sold Anne to get her away from John Kendall because he was aware that there was a scandal brewing. And I should just go ahead and state for the record, it didn't work. John and Anne would meet subsequent to this at John Webb's Inn in Northampton County on Virginia's eastern shoreline on November 28th of 1663. And we know that over the course of the weekend, they had sex multiple times. We know this because Anne subsequently revealed that she was pregnant, but not before her indenture had been sold again. At the time, she was the property of Jacob Bishop. Her indenture was owned by Jacob Bishop. Jacob Bishop subsequently sold her to Lieutenant Colonel William Waters, who was none too pleased that his servant was now having a baby that he would have to care for. So he sued Jacob Bishop, alleging that Bishop had knowingly sold her in her pregnant condition. Waters thus sued both to void the contract and to receive his money back. Now this by the way, is our first real experience that we've talked about in this class with a local court, because he went to the Northampton County Court, and this is where he registers his lawsuit. The 5 justices, 5 JPs, who made up the county court did not run a tight ship, and the trial record of Waters v. Bishop reveals this. Technical errors abound in the record. None of the technical errors, by the way, which would have been fatal in England, ever prejudice the case. They simply move forward. They get past little minor errors. Most of the current law, relevant English law, which technically, by the way, the Virginia court should have been applying, was completely unknown to the justices. Start with Waters' initial action. Waters sued for two things. One, to have the contract voided, and two, to have the money that he paid Bishop returned. But according to English law, the first part of the suit was good, but the second was not. In English law, one could sue for failure to deliver in a contract, but not for a defective delivery. And English law would not have favored Waters, as the principle of caveat emptor, which means buyer beware, was in operation there. But in Virginia, no mention of this principle is made. And in fact, the opposite principle, venditor emptor, is applied. The jury in that case would ultimately end up holding for Waters. And this was because Anne had proven to be with child. And it's worth it actually here to take a look at the jury finding. This is actually from the records. This is the jury finding in the case. The jury find that Jacob Bishop sold the said Lieutenant Colonel William Waters a maid that ailed nothing, but she proved to be with child. Therefore, they find Jacob Bishop hath not performed his bargain. Therefore, he ought to repay the said the said Lieutenant Colonel the tobacco back he hath received, and discharge him of the residue behind, and pay costs of suit. Now, I need to point out here that the jury, as it is working in Virginia, is performing a very different role than a jury would in England. And I'll talk about what an English jury would do in a second, but let's break down this actual finding here. What we have here is two explicit findings of fact. In this case, the first is the sale. The jury finds that Jacob Bishop sold the said Lieutenant Colonel William Waters a maid that ailed nothing. So there's the finding that, in fact, the sale occurred. The second is that they find that she, in fact, is pregnant, that she proved to be with child. These are explicit findings. The jury then also interprets the contract for the court. They declare here that the contract is a conditional contract. There were no conditions in the original bill of sale, nor were there any express warranties. So this idea that Jacob Bishop hath not performed his bargain is really a finding that flies in the face of the actual record. The lack of these things, I should notice, either the express warranty or express conditional contract would have been fatal in English law. This would have been the end of the story. But in Virginia, clearly, they are not. And this is partly because the justices did not exert a whole lot of control over the jury, and also partly because the colonial jury had more power than the English one. In England, the jury would have been instructed by the justices to find that, 1, the sale was consummated, and 2, it was the buyer's responsibility to confirm the quality of the item or person that he or she was buying. The English jury would have been confined to saying the contract is a contract. That would have been the finding of fact that they were required to find. That would be it. It would end there. At the time the jury issued its verdict, by the way, Anne was dead. She died in childbirth. During childbirth, she was interrogated by the midwife, and the midwife revealed John Kendall as the father. Just to be clear, childbirth is an extraordinarily dangerous time for mothers, and infant mortality and maternal mortality rates were appalling in the early modern world. With Anne dead and an infant alive that needed caring for, John Kendall took the unusual step of filing a petition with the Northampton County Court, asking the court to declare his innocence. I should mention here that his uncle, Colonel William Kendall, was one of the justices. He did recuse himself. The judges found against John's petition. John was legally responsible for the child, his name was Jasper, by the way, and required to support him. However, the court did say that John was morally innocent, partially because the justices believed that the child could not have been conceived at a time when John and Anne were together. And the justices are wrong about this, by the way. They misapplied medical information. They're also obviously clearly influenced by William Kendall, Colonel William Kendall, and his role in the community. But no matter. in Virginia, the childbirth declaration, that of Anne, of paternity in John Kendall, was irrebuttable, or to use the non-legal term for it, irrefutable. This was also a departure from English law, by the way. In English law, it would have been refutable. For Jasper, however, it would mean little. John Kendall was ordered to support him until such an age that he could in turn be indentured, at which point Jasper became an unfree indentured servant on his own. And also for the record, 20 years down the line, William Kendall would look out for his nephew's child. He made clear in his will his desire to help Jasper, even though he did not leave him any money. And his interest clearly swayed justices who ruled in a subsequent lawsuit that Jasper was free of his own denture at the age of 22. And thereafter, Jasper will absolutely disappear from history. But he disappears as a free man, and as far as we know, he dies one, landless but free. Now, there's a few takeaways from these stories that I hope you get. Not the least of which being that I've misspelled primitive here. Primitive, yeah, I don't know how that happened. Anyway, but the primitive form of law and justice meant something in terms of how English law would be adapted in the New World. There was a clear divergence of American and British customs. This is true whether we look at the role of the jury, which is greatly expanded in the New World, or the role of judges, which is actually crimped because of their inability to understand very technical parts of law. We also see that things do not develop in a straight line. Democracy and authority develop hand in hand, and experiments in democracy in the New England colonies will lead to this kind of start and stop history where there'll be a lot of experiments, but they'll necessarily end up being rolled back and then rolled forward again. So we don't want to impute a straight line in democratic development in any of the colonies. And of course, ultimately, we want to think about all of the legacies that were left. And we haven't actually spoken about many of them. For instance, the simple fact that Puritans all taught their children to read because being able to read was important to Puritan culture, was central to being able to be saved. The result is virtual 100% literacy in New England, the highest literacy of anywhere in the free world, and anywhere in the known world in the 17th and 18th centuries. This literate culture would have huge impact on America, as too, by the way, this is a copy of the Mayflower Compact, the recording of these legal and constitutional documents, which was largely done. We also have legacies in the Chesapeake. It's worth pointing out here that I know I haven't, but after the 1680s, the indentured servants start to decline, and planters start importing slaves. And by 1720, we have a significant slave population in the Chesapeake. It will be matched by an even larger slave population eventually in the Low Countries. And of course, the persistence of slavery, one of the great Chesapeake legacies, will become one of the most vexing constitutional problems in colonial America, or in all of America.